Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Jacob Rooksby, Dean of Gonzaga University School of Law, Professor of Law, and Professor of Education. We will discuss the process of becoming a dean and Jacob's experiences as a dean so far. So welcome to the podcast, Jacob.
Thanks, Brian. Good to be here.
Yeah. So I was wondering if we could start by you just telling listeners a little bit about yourself, sort of your background and, the kind of scholarship and positions you had before you became the dean at Gonzaga.
Sure. So just prior to becoming dean at Gonzaga, and I've been here since June of 2018, I was on the faculty at Duquesne University School of Law in Pittsburgh, and I received tenure there, was associate dean there. Prior to that, I practiced law with the firm McGuire Woods in Richmond, Virginia, and my focus was intellectual property litigation. I had gone back to do a PhD in higher education, and my research kind of trajectory has flowed from the work that I did in that PhD program, taking a look at colleges and universities and how they interact with intellectual property. So that was kind of what motivated my research agenda for a period of years, and that led to a book and some other things. And in part explains, I think, my interest in higher ed administration.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. But just to clarify, was the PhD a degree that you did before or after you entered legal academia?
So good question. I did it just immediately prior. I went to law school at the University of Virginia, and I actually did a master's in education in the social foundations of education while I was in law school. And for those who don't know, it was a program. It's kind of like the humanities of education. So philosophy, history, anthropology of education, looking at questions, why do we educate, for whom, for what? And, I was fascinated by all of that. I practiced right after law school, and mostly, like I said, patent litigation, IP litigation, but also we represented colleges and universities in a lot of different matters. And so that started to fuel an interest in higher ed law as well. And so that's, in part what led me to go back to complete the PhD and then go on the job market to be a law professor.
Right. So when you started as a law professor, did you already have sort of potential law school administration in mind, or was that something that developed during the course of your time at Duquesne?
I think it developed during my time at Duquesne. I think, my first priority was learning to become I think a decent teacher and advancing my scholarship, and that took years. And in the process, learning more about how higher ed governance works, faculty shared governance, administrative leadership. And, I think it hit me at some point during those years that it might be something in the future that I wanted to give a try.
Was the associate dean position you had at Duquesne sort of related to or like testing the waters for kind of making the move into administration?
It was, yeah. And it was not an associate dean for academic affairs position, which I think is probably the classic position for becoming a dean. It was actually associate dean of administration, which was a relatively new position there at Duquesne. But it ended up being, I think, a very helpful experience to me in terms of learning a lot about what a dean does. I got to work very closely with the dean there at the time, and was exposed to a lot of the sort of staff side operations of a law school that maybe, some faculty are not intimately familiar with. I certainly wasn't at that point in time. everything from, admissions to alumni relations, IT support, those sorts of things. That was mostly what I did as opposed to, coursework, course scheduling, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is the associate dean for administration position one that's common at law schools? I don't think we really have an equivalent at University of Kentucky. Is it something that's like that you've seen at other schools, and was it helpful for you in kind of getting a sense of, what the dean proper would be doing?
It definitely was helpful to me. I think it is a position that's not all that common, although I know other schools that do have it. And sometimes it's not occupied by a professor. Sometimes it is. Here at Gonzaga, we had that position before I got here, but it actually had been eliminated by the time I arrived. So I've seen it in different formulations in different places, but it's you're right. It's not necessarily everywhere, unlike an associate dean for academic affairs.
Yeah. Did you find that it was an effective position in sort of maybe faculty administration relationships? Like, what's your sense of what the goal for that kind of intermediate position is?
Yeah, in my case, I did find it to be effective because it exposed me to a variety of different constituencies. And I think sometimes the associate dean for academic affairs position, you may primarily just be engaging with faculty and maybe a few other staff members. In my case, it was a kind of broader look at some of the different pieces that come into play in operating a law school. So in that sense, it was very helpful. And I think there's a larger conversation about just exactly how helpful is any associate dean position in preparing one for a dean's job. And maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, that would actually be great. I mean, to kind of get a sense of what the differences are, because I have a sense that a lot of the listenership for the show is law professors, or at least a significant percentage of the listenership. And I would imagine that a lot of them, are either in those kinds of positions or have considered those kinds of positions, and might even be considering some of the, the decision that you made to move into administration. I'm sure it'd be helpful for people to get a sense of what the kind of experiential differences might be.
Yeah, I think they are, well, first of all, they're a lot of work, and I wouldn't recommend that anyone do an associate dean position unless they really have a strong interest in doing that work and improving the institution. That's the fun of it, though, is that you're in a trusted role where you really can make some decisions that will advance the trajectory of your institution. And that's fun. But there's a lot of, thankless tasks that come with those positions. And certainly one's scholarship will suffer when you take on those roles. There's no getting around it. And I miss that aspect. And I still have some scholarship goals ahead of me, and it's difficult to make time for them. But what I found is that there's very little concerted mentorship that goes on in higher education and preparing people for administrative roles. And good mentors can be hard to come by. They may not necessarily be at your own institution, and I think it is important to facilitate, and seek out those kinds of relationships. I've had them at different stages in my career, and I'm very thankful for it. But some of the skills that, one needs, I think, to be successful in these roles, may not be explicitly taught. And in fact, yet they can be taught. So it's a matter of finding, where can you get that lesson? Where can you get that teaching? In my case, I started to do a lot of reading. And honestly, I started reading some books that the titles of which I probably would have laughed at, years ago, thinking, why would anyone spend time reading that? But there were some valuable takeaways for me in terms of leadership and just sort of group dynamics and decision making. And so these things are, some feel like they're innate or whatever, and they may be to a degree, but I think really it's an area where one can be thoughtful and improve how they approach the position. And often I think in an associate dean's role, and certainly in a dean's role, there's not enough hours in the day. You have to really carve out the time to do that, because no one will otherwise suggest that you do it or require that you do it.
And maybe you could give a couple examples of particular books that you found helpful in kind of thinking about the sort of expectations or the new role that you would have in a dean position?
Yeah, so one that was recommended to me by someone outside of higher education it's called tribal leadership, and kind of a silly name. And, you read it, it seems like one of those, business school bestsellers that you might see in an airport somewhere. And to some extent it is. But it really kind of talks about different stages of organizational thinking. And it really resonated with me because it describes kind of a progression of institutional functioning. Institutions that function well tend to have certain kinds of group dynamics. And, and so they separate it into kind of levels. And you can do some analysis as to, at what level is your organization functioning and how can you get it from one level to the other? And, some of the one thing that stood out for me is there is a tendency, I think, for people to develop teams that they trust. And they also then develop people, that they know they don't work well with for whatever reason. And they start to avoid those people, right? And they start to come up with messages like, well, only so-and-so can be trusted, so let's only include that person in the conversation, and we'll work around someone else, which then only reaffirms that person's frustration of being worked around and then trying to obstruct, whatever the progression may be. When really, at base, everyone wants to be included. And it's much healthier for the organization when people are included in meetings. And so one of the suggestions of the book was never have a one-on-one meeting, because most likely there's someone else who should be at that table or in the room who you haven't invited. And so I kind of challenged myself to implement that, and started inviting people to meetings who weren't used to being invited to those meetings. And that was on me. I'd been at the institution I was at for a while and had sort of developed my teams of people or folks that I knew I worked well with, and, those that I tried to work around. And that really wasn't healthy. So that was a book that kind of gave me that thought. There are many others about higher education that I had been reading or had read already in my past background. And I continue to do that. I like to think kind of broadly about where higher education is going. And so there's a number of different, writers and thinkers who have good things to say on that topic.
Yeah, no. And it seems like, the advice of like not having or not creating kind of inside and outside groups within the institution would be especially important at an institution of higher education like law school, where, your ability to terminate the relevant people is pretty limited.
Right. No, absolutely. And I do think, though, there's a tendency for, any faculty or staff member when there is a new dean to say, okay, what's this mean for me? Is this person going to be good for me or bad for me? And they operationalize that in different ways. And part of a dean's job is attempting and working in good faith to be good for everyone. And I certainly see that as in my job description, that you aren't favoring one set of people or one group over another.
Yeah. Maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of the process of making the transition to sort of prepare to move into administration. Like, was there a precipitating moment, or was this kind of a process that took place over a long period of time? And sort of what were the steps that you took to sort of prepare yourself to make that move?
Yeah, I had talked to a couple of trusted colleagues at my own institution and elsewhere who had pursued deanship opportunities or were currently a dean, and learned a little bit just about the process. In my particular case, I wasn't overly anxious to move, and certainly moving across the country was a big move for us. But I heard from a search firm that had been retained by Gonzaga to lead the search for the next dean, and I read the prospectus and I thought, this sounds interesting. There's some things in there about Spokane and about Gonzaga that really spoke to me. And I thought, I'll call up this person who sent me this email and just get more information. And I did that. We ended up having a great conversation and kind of hit it off on the phone. And I thought, I think I'm going to apply. But I wanted to do it intentionally, and I didn't want to just start, sending off letters willy-nilly. And I know that's an approach that some have taken, and I think I would caution against it. And from what I learned in the process, that can come through to people on the other end, where there's some folks who just want to be a dean, or they just want to get out of their institution for whatever reason. That was not me. And so I hope that came through in the letter that I wrote, but it certainly was something that I put a lot of time, effort, thought, and energy into. And I can't imagine doing it lightly. That said, I've now had occasion to read other people's letters, and, I kind of try to counsel people, if this isn't the exact kind of school you want to be at, then, maybe you shouldn't be going through the process. And I do think there's some things that one can do in the cover letter to, start to put the best foot forward, and speak very specifically to accomplishments, and speak very specifically to what is in the job ad, right? Because, every institution is different in where they are in their trajectory and their history. And showing some sensitivity and care for that, I think, is important. So, in my case, then, I was happy to be selected for a first round interview, which was actually out in Spokane, with 15 people in the room, and I had not interviewed for anything in years. I was kind of daunted by this prospect, but I knew what it was going to be like. I had been told, here's who's on the committee, and this is what the room's going to be like. So I prepared a lot for it, and I kind of mooted my performance with family members and some others, and thought through potential questions and what I would say and that sort of stuff. And one thing that I think I heard after the fact from colleagues now who were part of that process is that, that meant something, that I cared enough to do the homework to prepare for not only the first round interview, but then certainly the callback interview. And I was struck because I was like, well, certainly everyone does that, right? And, apparently not. Some kind of dial it in because, again, maybe they have 5 lines in the water and this one isn't the most, appealing one, or whatever the case may be. They're busy and just don't have the time to do it. It's an investment. And I think that's something I learned as well. Like this was my first application for a deanship, and I was delighted to be selected, also sort of surprised. But I put a lot of effort into it, and I can't imagine, having the wherewithal to do that, at scale. So I think some people just say, okay, well, I'm not going to put in that effort. I'm going to kind of throw out the applications and see what sticks. And then they may, be surprised that they're not getting any callbacks, or, they're not advancing to the next round. I think a focus on, the one right in front of you that's of interest is critical.
I was wondering if you could talk with a little more kind of specificity, if you can, about like what specifically you were looking for in an institution that you thought would make it a good fit for you, and maybe also kind of your impression of what Gonzaga was looking for that made you a good fit for it. I mean, beyond your obvious kind of preparation to sort of show that you were, legitimately interested, and kind of how you would think about that issue more broadly. Because I guess I've always kind of just assumed that, law schools and other institutions of higher education have a kind of Tolstoyan cast, right? Like every happy institution is happy in the same way, and every unhappy institution is unhappy in its own unique way. I don't really have any basis for that. I'm just kind of assuming it. Am I right? Or,
to some degree, I think, but, I've certainly discern some differences. I think one thing, okay, so right away, a question I had for the search consultant was, is this a real search? And, I had learned enough from talking to folks that, and, just through my studies of higher education, that some searches with outside firms are simply to bless a preordained outcome anyway, right? There's an internal candidate who's favored and is most likely going to get the job. I didn't see the point in going through the process if that were the case. And I was assured, and subsequently found out that there were no internal interest in by anyone on the faculty for the dean's position, and that was actually telling of, I think, where the institution was in this particular moment in its history, and actually wanting someone from a different place to come and bring fresh ideas and new visions for going forward. So that actually became quite appealing because I knew it was sort of a blank slate in that regard. There were other aspects about, this institution. So I had been at another Catholic school that was not Jesuit. I had gone to a Jesuit high school, though, in Indianapolis, where I grew up, and had been profoundly impacted by Jesuits in my life. Ironically, I'm not Catholic, but I really found that the Jesuits' approach to education was a compelling one, and one that really set me on my trajectory in life. My wife and I were married by the rector of my high school, a Jesuit priest. So I knew a thing or two about Jesuit educational philosophy and believed in it. And at the same time, had been in a Catholic institution that wasn't Jesuit, and I thought was missing some of its potential or opportunity with respect to kind of being a private school, a faith-based institution. I think we have more degrees of freedom in important ways than public schools. And I had gone to a public law school, so I had seen those differences. And I really made that part of my approach in the interview. There's other things that I learned about the community here in Spokane. It has a very vibrant intellectual property bar, which was appealing, but also somewhat unusual given the location of Spokane, the inland Northwest. And, also had a great community here in medicine for my wife. She's an anesthesiologist. So there were a lot of things that community-wise spoke to us. This was not just, another law school somewhere that, we will love the community kind of thing. It was actually these things we found appealing. And also, being a student of higher education, the more I learned about our law school and how it fits within the university here, I felt that I had some things to contribute. And I think our law school at Gonzaga is not unique in the sense that for many years it was built up as a very separate type of entity, arm's length relationship with the university. And that's typical in a lot of different places, and reason being very similar, that law schools were cash cows for the university for decades. And so the notion was, leave us alone, and we're doing just fine without you. Well, of course, times have changed in legal education, and I think we're seeing nationwide law schools come closer into the fold of the university, and that's been a good thing. I have a lot of background in higher ed, studying it, writing about it. And so I felt like I had some skills to bring into that conversation. And here at Gonzaga, those were things that, the senior leadership, they were interested in as well.
Yeah. So in preparation for actually becoming dean, once you decided to go after the job, and even more so kind of once you got the job and had to kind of prepare yourself to actually do it, what kind of expectations did you have based on your own research and maybe on conversations with other people who are providing advice? And sort of to what extent were those expectations confirmed? And were there any surprises once you actually stepped into the role?
That's a great question. I think I reached out to colleagues that I knew who had done this before, were in the role. There is what they call the baby dean school. The ABA puts on in June for deans. Everyone meets in Chicago, and folks who have done this before kind of lead the programming. And there's a lot of discussion around the water cooler about what to expect and what it's like. There's an element of truth to the kind of notion that you can't really know what it's like until you do it. And I remember, starting in June, and, immediately some situations came about where I thought, wow, I remember as an associate dean, these things came about. And, they're hard, difficult situations involving students or alumni or whatever the case may be, faculty. But you ultimately are not responsible for the decision, and you provide input on the decision. And then it hit me, I'm like, wait a second. Oh, the buck stops here. I actually have to be satisfied with where we come out on this. And that was a little bit of a scary moment, for sure. And then you get used to it. There's something to be said for the hours deans keep, or usually quite long, and there's always more work to be done, right? And so I think initially, part of the struggle for me was learning when to leave the office, and learning really what needs my attention today versus what is a slower burn type project, and taking some solace in knowing that not everything is going to change tomorrow, right? That some of these projects are much longer duration, and that's healthy, normal, and good. That's no reflection on the dean necessarily. So that took a little bit of getting used to. I think on the other end, there were some things that I thought, well, gosh, this isn't rocket science. And sometimes people, they talk about deanships in a way that make folks feel like, they're inaccessible or not for me, or I must saturate as a professor or as an associate dean for 40 years, and then maybe I'll be ready. And I don't think any of that is true. I mean, mostly what I have found that, the dean's role, it requires humanity, and it requires some perspective on life. And I don't think anyone has a lock on that based upon age or experience, or, have they published, in certain law reviews or those kinds of things don't correlate at all with their ability to manage and work with people and inspire people. So those aspects of the job, I find I draw from aspects of my life and background that oftentimes have nothing to do with me as a law professor, or with me as, teaching or writing. They're not related at all. And you look back and say, gosh, how can you prepare for that then? And, I don't know. I'm still kind of working through that. But I think anything that, I'll tell you one thing where I felt, as I look back on what I've done in life, one experience that I think did prepare me for this very well, and it's going to sound silly, but right out of law school, we bought a condo in Richmond, Virginia, and it was in a new condo building where they were just starting a condo association. The builders were, handing off the management of the condo. And so we go to a first meeting of the condo association. They said, we need to elect a board, and we need to elect a president. And I was fresh out of law school, excited to put some of my knowledge to work. I'm like, yeah, I'll do this. Sure. This sounds fun. No one else wanted to do it very wisely. so I got elected president.
If you think being a dean is thankless,
yeah,
huh?
Exactly. I got elected president of our small little 13-member condo association board. And I thought, there's not going to be anything really to this, the amount of things that I quickly learned about my neighbors, and the complaints and the issues that all of a sudden were delivered to me, and I was supposed to find a way out. We got into disputes with different, I won't bore you with the details, but I would tell my students about it in torts, and I would say, at some point in your life, you may own a condo or in a townhome or something, and there's an association. Do not be on the board. Whatever you do, run away. But I look back on that now, and I think, God, I learned a lot actually about how to interact with people, and certainly when there's conflict or the potential for conflict, how to navigate some of that. So again, that's a skill that wasn't born out of my experience as a law professor.
Yeah. Well, you are a professor as well as being a dean, and I know that's common among law school deans, but not universal. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about balancing those two roles in your new position, and sort of if there are any kind of pluses and minuses to having a dean professor versus a dean, some other prior role.
Yeah, I will say one thing I noticed coming to Gonzaga, I, as mentioned, had not been on the faculty here before, so I was not known to students in the classroom. And so immediately people are meeting me as the dean. And at our institution, that has historically meant a pure administrator. And deans have, some of my predecessors, to be sure, have taught, but maybe not right away. And maybe, years went by and then they returned to the classroom. So one thing I felt strongly about was that I, first and foremost, I'm a professor. I want my colleagues to see me as that. And, I think the students, I would like for them to see me as that, and to understand that teaching and scholarship are really important parts of who I am. So at the same time, I was advised by many deans, "Oh, you won't have time to do it." I thought that too. And, I haven't taught, and there's just too much to do. You travel, you're, with alums, that sort of thing. And, there may be something to be said for the size of our institution is smaller than some law schools. And maybe at a larger law school, it frankly is impossible to teach. But in my case, I really felt like this is something that I want to do, and I want to try to make time for. So that will start for me next year. And we have, a colleague or two who may be going on sabbatical. So there's some needs in our curriculum that I might be able to help with. And actually, this semester we had an opening in our externship program and a need for someone to teach an externship course. So I'm actually stepping in and doing that, which I'm happy to do. And it's kind of it's a new thing for me. I didn't participate in an externship when I was in law schools because I'm pretty certain we didn't have them. And I was lightly familiar with what they entailed at my time at Duquesne, but had never really given much thought to it. And now I am. So it's a great way for me to kind of learn more about how we operate and get in the classroom and interact with some students.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, I think that kind of being a more immediate kind of presence for the students must be really, really a positive as well. I was wondering if maybe I could ask you to, and this question's a little bit more maybe speculative or not drawn directly from your experience, but I imagine you must have thought about it. I mean, it's my sense from the outside of administration as a faculty member that like different schools looking for new deans, often will fall into like different circumstances, right? I mean, there's some schools where it's a healthy institution that's just making a normal transition to a new leadership, after a period of time or a retirement or a transition or a lateral move of some kind by their former dean. But there are other schools where there's like a problem at the institution and they're looking to change it or fix it. And I was wondering if you could like reflect for just a moment on like the differences between those two, and like, are there different people who would be more appropriate for one than the other? And like, how would you think about those two relationships in terms of people thinking about kind of making this shift? Because it seems like the latter obviously might be a lot more daunting in some ways than the former.
Yeah. So this kind of goes back to which skills correlate with success in a deanship. What does that institution need at this particular moment in time? And you're right. Some institutions are probably they're functioning so well that they simply need a figurehead at the top who can impress outside audiences on the basis of their intellectual prowess and accomplishment. And those things are, important to that institution. I've not been at such a place, so I'm not as directly familiar with that model, but I have seen it. But I also know some of those people, and I've gotten to know some of those folks, and I'm not certain that they could, lead their way out of a paper bag, but they are, they are leading putatively a large organization. And, maybe they do it well, but maybe there's also very little required because everything's functioning fine, right? I think at many more institutions and ones that I've been more familiar with, there are problems that need to be worked through. Nothing that doesn't have a solution or that cannot be solved, but there needs to be some form of leadership, and that requires some aptitude and or interest, certainly an interest in taking on that responsibility, and that is not something for everyone. And that is not something that I think, being a professor necessarily prepares one to do well. I said, and I certainly believe that, to the extent that we have problems or issues, I want to know about them, one, but two, I want to be part of the hard work of solving them. And that means going where people are. That means rolling up one's sleeves and, putting on the thinking cap and trying to work through these things. And I think every institution probably has some elephants in the room in terms of things that people know these are issues or problems, but we don't talk about them. And often those are the very things that inhibit success or growth or progression as an institution. And I said, and I believe, I'm firmly committed to recognizing those elephants and seeing what we can do to remove them from the room. That may not happen in one semester, in 1 year, 2 years, 3. It could be a longer project, but it doesn't mean that you avoid doing that. And I think this gets to, a broader, larger existential question for a prospective dean. What is it that you want to be your legacy? What do you really hope to accomplish? And I certainly think there are some schools that, would let the dean off easy in that, and just, hey, come here for, 3 to 5 years and, be the person at the top that can, we can advertise and that sort of thing. But we're not really looking for any transformative change. There are other folks who are actually interested or committed to the harder project of how do we truly improve this institution from the inside out? What does that take? And that's what I'm interested in doing. And that's what drew me here.
Yeah. Well, Jake, I got to say, I mean, it's so great and inspiring to see someone like you in this kind of position, really kind of committed to improving and working with the place that you work. And I got to say, this is a subject area I am, very much a professor and very much not an administrator. So this has been incredibly informative to me. And I'm wondering if there's anything that I just didn't know to ask you about. Have I left anything out that you think is really important that people should hear before we close?
Gosh, no, I think we've covered what was on my mind. And I would just say that, these are great jobs, but it's servant leadership. It's meeting people where they are and trying to find what is that aspect of a person's professional life that is the aspect that will help the institution the most, and how do you bring that out and give that best perspective on who they are, so that we can all share in that. And that's special work to get to do, and it's an honor to get to do it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jacob. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Good talking with you, Brian.
If I rule the world, every day would be the first day of spring. Every heart would have a new song to sing. And we'd sing of the joy every morning would bring. If I rule the world, every man would be as free as a bird. Every voice would be a voice to be heard. Take my word, we would treasure each day that occurred. My world would be a beautiful place where we would weave such wonderful dreams. My world would wear a smile on its face, like the man in the moon as when the moon beams. If I rule the world, every man would say the world was his friend. There'd be happiness that no man could end. No, my friend, not if I rule the world. Every head would be held up high. There'd be sunshine in everyone's sky. If the day ever dawned